Hi. So, I've been working on a version of this video since about 2015, trying to convey my frustration with the anime Attack on Titan, based on my experience of watching the first episode of the anime. But no matter the version of the script that I had worked on, I was never satisfied with the final product. I thought Eren wanting to leave the walls of his hometown was somehow a contradiction to his desire to keep the Titans outside of the wall, but I lacked the language to properly explain why I felt that this was a contradiction. And to be honest, even in this version of this video, I'm not sure that I succeeded. However, after experiencing a global plague and feeling trapped within my own home, I think I finally found my Rosetta Stone to better explain why I didn't like the first episode of Attack on Titan. But in doing the research, I was no longer satisfied with just talking about the first episode because I wanted to reach a conclusion that better reflected the direction of the pilot chapter that was written in 2006. But I also didn't want to read through all of Attack on Titan just so that I can talk about the first episode. So, this video is going to cover the first major arc of the series, the Battle for Trost, and every other adaptation that covers roughly the same arc. This includes chapters of the manga, the pilot chapter, Attack on Titan Junior High, the Crimson Bow and Arrow movie, and the 2 live-action Japanese films. I'm not going to be covering the video games, and I'm not going to go beyond the first 13 episodes because I have to stop somewhere. With that having been said, my name is Simon, and I am, sadly, I am an anime fan. But my library and general knowledge of anime, I think might be a little bit shallow. Here's the rundown of my history with anime. When I was a kid, I was watching the Ocean dub of Dragon Ball Z and Sailor Moon, I was watching the 4Kids dub of Pokemon, and anything that was available on Fox Kids, also called the Fox Box in the early 2000s, with shows like Digimon, Metabots, and Shaman King. As I got older, I was watching shows that were part of Canada's YTV Friday night anime lineup, which included Inuyasha and Dot Hack Sign. And I remember reading the manga of Naruto and Bleach in the school library, provided that I wasn't watching clips of Advent Children on YouTube. Anything that I didn't discover on my own through television or the library, I had to learn about through recommendations. This is how I found out about shows like Death Note, Full Metal Alchemist, Gurren Lagann, and later shows like My Hero Academia. I made a video about My Hero Academia, and even though I have my own problems with it, overall I would say that these have been very positive recommendations. But there have been a couple of recommendations that I've been told, hey Simon, don't you worry about it, that show's gonna get better later. Which I hate. That's a huge red flag for me. I obsess over the quality of the first episode, and if I am unimpressed by that first impression, then I'm just not likely to watch a second episode regardless of the pedigree that show might have. Which, to be fair, is likely why my pool of anime knowledge happens to be so shallow. Although I will say that what constitutes a show getting better later is obviously subjective. I have friends who think that Naruto only really gets good during the Chunin exams because, hey, it happened to be the arc where their favorite characters showed up. But for me, I was in love with the show since the first episode. Now, I'm no longer watching Naruto, or even Boruto, because it just became too much. But when I was watching it, I was so drawn to this character, this sad, lonely kid who acted goofy with the other kids, but was treated unfairly as a monster by the adults just because of the strange circumstances of his birth, which they used to justify alienating him from their kids, perpetuating this one kid's loneliness. Like, the only other show that I've seen that comes close to tackling an invisible disability or a neurodivergent metaphor, as I thought Naruto had, was My Hero Academia, but at least Naruto didn't completely rewrite the premise of its own series by ruining its own metaphor by the third episode. Although, to be clear, when I'm talking about a neurodivergent metaphor behind Naruto, I'm not necessarily trying to diagnose the character, but rather pointing out the way the adults treat him, as though there was something wrong with him, feels very similar to the way that real people might treat individuals who behave differently to their own collective expectations that they perceive as being abnormal behavior. So I'm less interested in Naruto's behavior, and I'm more interested in the behavior of the adults around him. Though I will give the main character of My Hero Academia a diagnosis, because that show is way more obvious about it, and it was the author's original intent, which is why I found the ruined metaphor to be a disappointment. But My Hero Academia being a disappointment was a genuine surprise based on how good I thought the first 2 episodes were. I cannot say I had the same level of enthusiasm about the first episode of Attack on Titan, because I have, frankly, never liked the first episode of Attack on Titan, which is the anime that we are talking about. It's not just because the anime mom dies at the end of it, which was very sad, or how exactly she dies, which I thought was very frustrating, but she is ostensibly the reason I didn't like the first episode. To be more specific, for the longest time, I could not understand or process the morality of Attack on Titan through the lens of its main character, Eren Jaeger. In the world of Attack on Titan, the main character Eren Jaeger lives in a closed-off, claustrophobic, post-apocalyptic society, and he wants to join the military not just because they have the best uniforms, but because only a specific branch of the state military, the Survey Corps, also known as the Scouts, can actively leave the massive walls that surround him and venture forth into the open, wider world beyond the walls. But this job is super dangerous because the outside world is filled with these giant man-eating monsters called Titans that have, as far as we know, killed the rest of the known human population. Throughout the first episode, the source of the main character's frustration appears to be his perception of the world's complacency. That the greater society at large don't appear to be motivated and moving beyond their own confinement, and instead are satisfied with the current state of things, which Eren Jaeger objects to because he can't stand the idea of living the same days of his life over and over again behind the shadow of these walls. For this 12-year-old protagonist, it might be sympathetic for him to be asking, why aren't the adults in charge trying harder to fix the world? But for this specific context, I don't see this as the adults trying to take away this kid's freedom. I see this as a public health issue. The threat of the Titans are real. It's not a conspiracy. And the people in this world are aware of the danger they impose, including the main character. So I can't really sympathize with his general attitude towards people he referred to as cattle because it feels unfairly callous towards them.
一生壁の中から出られなくても飯食って寝てりゃ生きていけるよ。まるで家畜じゃないか。俺には家畜でも平気でいられる人間の方がよっぽど間抜けに見えるね。
Not helping with this case further is the art direction of the show. The fantasy world that he lives in is framed like a goddamn beautiful paradise, but through the lens of the main character, I'm supposed to feel anxious about being stuck in this awful, awful place. Now, the fall of Walmaria is meant to be a tragedy because we're witnessing the loss of our safe, surrogate, nostalgic childhood home. But the main character already hates this place and actively wants to volunteer for the adventuring job just so he can leave. So as a viewer, I'm left with the interesting choice of either agreeing with the main character hating the major setting and actively rooting for them to go on the big adventure outside, or hating the protagonist for being an idiot and not recognizing the privilege he gets to live in while he has it. I'm starting to not like this show, and we still haven't even gotten to the part where the Titans show up. To be fair, some of Eren's desire to join the military does appear to be based on his genuine desire to honor the soldiers who have fallen in their efforts to expand the human territory from the Titans, which is the entire point of the funereal march halfway into the first episode. There's this recurring fear happening throughout the first arc that the lives and efforts of the fallen soldiers may have been in vain, and that theme doesn't really get paid off until the end of the arc in the 13th episode.
いや、今回も何の成果も得られませんでした。
ここで誰も続く人がいなかったら、今までに死んだ人たちの命が無駄になる。このまま何の役にも立てずに死ぬのでしょうか。みんな死んだ甲斐があったな。
Unfortunately, this is the first episode, and as hyperbolic as it might seem, I already said that I basically have a one-episode policy. So for now, there is no reprieve from this nihilism coded throughout the first episode. The world of Attack on Titan is meant to be a miserable place for a pretty long time. Compare the first episode of Attack on Titan with the first episode of Gurren Lagann, which begins with a very similar freedom versus security narrative, where the heroes begin their journey within an enclosed society and are scolded for even attempting to escape into the outside world. The difference between the two shows, aside from genre and tone, is that the known world that the cast of Gurren Lagann are trapped in is actively awful in a way that's transparent to the audience. There's no sunlight, there's little vegetation, there's constant earthquakes and cave-ins that's actively killing them. It is constantly, remarkably claustrophobic. And while it does turn out that the surface world is under the tyranny of giant mechs thrashing about, the people living underground don't know that, and have no reason to believe that living underground is meant for their own safety.
毎日毎日こうやって地震に怯えながら生きていくのかよ。地上に天井はねえんだぞ。
But given the dangers of the outside world, the visual storytelling and the written screenplay are actively working together to push the heroes and the audience to choose the surface world over the underground, to choose freedom over security, because that is the clear side that Gurren Lagann has taken on this particular debate. I want to root for these heroes to leave the underground because I am meant to believe that their lives will be better for it. But for the cast of Attack on Titan, I'm not entirely sure I want them to leave. And I don't think the first episode makes a good argument for it. Though on the subject of having an argument, let's finally talk about Eren's mom. What little characterization we get out of her early on is that the two of them are prone to arguing with each other, and that this is not the first time that they've butt heads like this, though this could be the first time they've argued about Eren becoming a member of the Scouts specifically.
俺が担いで逃げるよ。どうしていつも母さんの言うことを聞かないの。最後から言うことを聞いてよ。
She opposes her son from joining the military because of the obvious occupational hazard, and through the lens of the rebellious preteen protagonist, this makes her an obstacle that Eren will have to overcome, provided that the story doesn't do it for him. Because fuck you, Mom, I'm joining the army. Now, whether Eren wants to join the military to see the outside world, honor the troops, or upset his mom, none of those reasons matter by the end of the first episode, because Eren Jaeger gets a brand new motivation to join the same branch of the military that he already wanted to join that completely overshadows every other motivation he had for joining the military. revenge.
I still remember what I promised you. For the people of this planet, I promise you revenge!
So Eren's mom dies. Pretty graphically too. First, her house falls on her, which would have been enough to kill her. But then a titan breaks her in half, just to stop her from struggling. And then that same titan finally eats her. Seems to me like that's a bit overkill. And with her death by Titan, Eren will now vow revenge on all Titans for killing his mom, leading him to joining the military. Which, you know, is the exact same job that his mother explicitly told him not to do. If Eren Jaeger is set to joining the military no matter what, either his previous motivations up to this point have become completely redundant to the story, or his mother's death to be avenged has. Just because she doesn't want him joining the action-heavy shonen job of this fictional universe doesn't mean she should be killed by the karmic will of the author over it. Because fuck you, Mom, I'm going to avenge you. And look, I get it. I do, I get it. Attack on Titan is an anime with a target demographic of teenagers. The story is written for teenagers, and so the hero gets to be a teenager. And it's really hard for anime teenagers to go on amazing adventures when they're stuck living with their parents. And for writers who have to keep track of an ever-expanding cast of characters, it's so much easier to just drop the parents from the roster who could otherwise veto or manipulate the actions of the hero in a way that an otherwise non-related supporting character could. It's so common for anime parents to be either constantly working abroad, missing in action, or dead. Some of that might be cultural experience, but I got to imagine that some of it is also for expediency and built-in drama. A dead parent is an easy backstory. It's immediately sympathetic, and it ages a hero in a way that makes them stand out from other members of the cast without making them precocious. But you can still be cruel about it. Not every anime mom has the luxury of dying with an illness surrounded by loved ones, but Carla's death in particular did not have to be so, for a lack of a better word, pornographic? I think of her death as a misapplied catharsis. Not incorrect, but certainly cruel. And one that repels me from the show. For a mother who's supposed to be overprotective of her son, she doesn't even get to meaningfully choose to sacrifice herself to protect her children. The choice was made for her when God dropped a rock on her. But there is significance in the choice that the first person eaten by a Titan on screen happens to be the audience surrogate mother. The catharsis of her demise is supposed to gin up our own desire to see the hero kill these monsters. A feeling that I try to stay wary of given the genre, but we'll talk about that when we're talking about the role that the Titans play later. For now, I'm focused on the hero who's now presumably been given the audience's permission to seek out and kill the other. And unfortunately for Attack on Titan, I'm not convinced that I want to watch this character be the protagonist and bear that responsibility, given that this character's attitude or trajectory doesn't appear to have changed all that much after the death of his mom. Maybe I would have been more receptive of this character if he had begun the story less volatile and more docile up until the death of his mom, and then become the version of Eren Jaeger that we all recognize. Because as he currently is, and knowing the context, I really can't stand this character. And the idea that this character, this is the one who's going to be the protagonist of the story, I think is a bad sign of things to come in Attack on Titan moving forward, regardless of how good the show gets later on. And with my one episode policy, the only way I was going to watch another episode was through bribery, which is exactly what happened.
Feasting on the insides of your enemies? How easily you ignore the loss of life when it suits your convenience. So tell me, who saves the weak from the man who saves the weak?
When it comes to the subject of anime versus manga, I usually prefer the animated adaptation over the printed source material because there's more room for the adaptation to improve upon the original text. Like, say, the addition of new scenes that enhances the text that wasn't in the original. Voice acting is a huge thing, voice acting that conveys the heart of the story, and music for the mood of the scene. This is a very long and somewhat pretentious way of just saying, I prefer watching TV over reading books. But the story within the manga of Attack on Titan has a very specific flow to it that the anime rearranges in a way that honestly kind of bugs me. Over the course of the original manga chapters that covers the first major arc, the story and the artwork of the author, Hajime Isayama, does seem to genuinely improve over time with each chapter. The turning point for me was the introduction to the character of Levi, and the slight shift in tone that balances the danger of the setting with the visual thrill of watching these soldiers swing between buildings like a steampunk Spider-Man. After the battle for Trost, the manga goes into a brief flashback arc that acts as a breather from the previous, more intense arc, but maintaining the tone established from Levi's introduction and sets up important character beats that will be paid off in the next immediate arc of the series. Even though the chronology of events has taken a step back in the manga, telling the story in a non-linear fashion, the tone and overall quality of Attack on Titan are improving within a linear direction. But the anime rearranges the chapters into a chronological order, messing up that linear flow of the story being told. When I saw the anime for the first time, I thought that the story of Attack on Titan was suddenly not committing to its dour tone from its first 2 episodes, and was instead trying to course correct itself into a broader market appeal. I felt like I was being directly pandered to, which made me angrier at the tonal whiplash of the series. You don't get to start with a funereal tone and then try to cheer me up with a potato girl. It's not gonna work. Flashbacks aren't just events that take place in the past. They're story beats meant to relay important pieces of information as it becomes relevant to the story's present. There's a reason that faithful adaptations don't usually mess with the chronology of how the story is told. So, in this specific way, I actually prefer the manga over the anime, even though the anime is unquestionably better to look at. But if we're going to be talking about a really bad flashback that shouldn't even be in this story, we should talk about the character of Mikasa Ackerman and her origin story in what is probably the worst episode of the entire arc. Oh, I hate the first episode more. This might be the worst one. Now up to this point, Mikasa has been this quiet, straight-laced, kind of stoic, but loyal tag-along character to Eren Jaeger, who deeply cares about his safety, but isn't afraid to put him in his place when he's being unreasonably stubborn. Given her age in the first episode, I just assumed this was her given personality, and I didn't think that a stoic character needed to be traumatized in some way to justify their stoicism. Besides, at this point in the story, she already would have had a tragic backstory when she lost her guardian, Eren's mother, who pleaded with her to take care of Eren, and the loss of Eren himself in episode 5 could have acted as her new origin story, provided that Eren had stayed dead and Mikasa had taken the mantle of the new protagonist, but I'll get back to that later. Instead, we learn about her tragic backstory, where, as a child, she saw her parents murdered in front of her and then was nearly sold off by sex traffickers. Which, I mean, look, I know humans are often monsters in this kind of genre, but I don't really want to think about a world where someone could be sold off as a sex slave or be eaten by a titan, and then as a viewer start thinking about which of these two would be worse. In a fantasy world where people can be eaten by giants, I think it's kind of weird that her parents are just straight up plain vanilla murdered. But establishing the existence of a sex trafficking ring in the fantasy world of Attack on Titan is not the reason I don't like this episode, though it clearly doesn't help. The reason I don't like this episode is because of Eren Jaeger again, who, in the flashback, is revealed to already be this precocious little psychopath murdering the kidnappers and subsequently teaching Mikasa the kill or be killed mentality that changes her into the stoic guardian we see her as in the present.
このけだものめお前らなんかこうだこうなって当然だ有害なけだものを駆除したたまたま人と格好が似ていただけのけだものだ
They're like animals, and I slaughtered them like animals. I hate them.
Now at this point in the story, and after a pretty decent fake out, we're supposed to believe that Eren Jaeger in the present tense is dead, and this flashback seems to partly play out as a fond memory of him. And while I have no sympathy for the sex traffickers, they're allowed to get their comeuppance through violence, even murder. But I don't want to see 10-year-old Eren Jaeger be a murderer. I don't want to see Mikasa kill someone as a child and for that memory to be framed, no matter how small, within a positive light. In Alan Moore's Watchmen, there's a similar sequence where the character Rorschach also hunts down the location of a missing girl and subsequently kills the kidnapper after discovering what had happened to her. This sequence is also a flashback explaining the origin of Rorschach's worldview, that the world is godless, cruel, and unfair. But in Watchmen, this entire chapter is framed as a tragedy, not just for the little girl, but also for Rorschach, who could never go back to being the softer superhero he claims he once was. In the Zack Snyder film, the murder of the kidnapper is admittedly framed more viscerally, more personal, more cathartic than the original graphic novel, but it's still not a happy memory. It's maybe a much more exciting scene, because Zack Snyder is good at making cool-looking movies, even though they might mess with the tone of the original's intention.
Men get arrested. Dogs get put down.
Now, I don't need permission to like or dislike any fictional character, good or evil, but I think there's value in understanding the authorial intention of the text. And in the text of Alan Moore's Watchmen, I know that I'm not really supposed to like Rorschach, even though I kinda do. As for Eren Jaeger within the context of Attack on Titan, I think that we're supposed to like him. And if so, that the intent is that we're supposed to agree with his worldview. His actions throughout the first arc, whether it's when he rescues Mikasa when the two were just kids, or the attempted rescue of his mom, or saving his friend Armin from being eaten by a Titan, or using his transformed Titan ability to seal off the whole of Wall Rose, his actions are framed too heroically to then paint his worldview as anything but positive commentary. If we're not supposed to agree with his worldview, then Eren Jaeger has not received enough ideological pushback from the other characters. At most, another character will tell him that his actions are risky, reckless, or maybe dangerous, but not that his position is wrong. In fact, I'm pretty sure Eren wins over the admiration of his fellow soldiers, so if his ideology is supposed to be wrong, you cannot trust an audience to be able to discern that on their own. This is sort of what I meant when I said earlier that I don't think that Eren Jaeger can bear the responsibility of being the protagonist. Going back to the flashback in episode 6, Eren does save a little girl from a terrible fate, but his actions and behavior seem less like an intended rescue and more like premeditated murder. That the younger version of Eren Jaeger was looking for an excuse to kill someone and was given an author-approved, audience-expected, divine permission to kill people. And that rescuing Mikasa in the process feels more like a bonus, so the two can have an awkward meet-cute. Maybe I'd feel differently if Eren and Mikasa had both been captured together, and then during a failed attempt to escape, have Eren kill these men in self-defense. It'd still be a rescue, Eren could still impart the kill or be killed methodology, provided that's necessary, and Mikasa could still view the experience through a lens of hope without also framing Eren as a predator. When it comes to anime shonen protagonists, I do have my own preferences for what I want to see in the leading role. But look, I understand that Eren Jaeger does not have to be a saint. He doesn't have to try to save all lives like Vash the Stampede. But I'd rather he not have the exact same philosophy as the main antagonist of Trigun.
That was the easiest way to stop him. You wanted to save the butterfly, right?
I didn't want to kill the spider, I wanted to save them both.
What are you talking about? Unless the spider caught the butterfly, it would die of starvation anyway. You can't save both, don't you know that?
But okay, don't change a thing, keep episode 6 the way it is. What does this new information actually add to the story? Because now I have serious doubts about Eren's real honest intentions on joining the military, and I'm left with the lingering thought that maybe the world might just be better off without the protagonist running around endangering people. Maybe it's a good thing that Eren Jaeger is dead. So of course, much to my disappointment, he isn't. In 2006, 19-year-old Hajime Isayama submitted a one-shot manga for a contest entitled Shingeki no Kyojin, which tells the story of a soldier named Murakumo, who was the only known survivor of a previous mission to defend his home from giant man-eating monsters called Titans. But because the Titans have the ability to shapeshift into their victims, Murakumo is immediately suspected of being a Titan in disguise when he returns home. Admittedly, that does turn out to be true, but he uses his newfound ability to transform into a Titan to defend his home village when shapeshifting Titans infiltrate the town square and begin to terrorize the place, ultimately sacrificing his life in the battle. Incidentally, while the character of Murakumo shares some familiar story beats with the canonical Eren Jaeger of Attack on Titan, the two end up being very different characters. Murakumo is portrayed as a much more collected, easygoing character who is able to brush aside the glares and mistrust of his fellow villagers in order to fight for and protect them. However, the pilot chapter also has an apocalyptic "the Titans are going to kill us all" narration from a supporting character named Tsubaki, a preteen who idolizes Murakumo above the other soldiers and desires to become a soldier just like him so that they can exact revenge on all Titans for killing their parents. In fact, Tsubaki's desire for revenge is so strong that they recklessly charge into battle, forcing Murakumo to step in and is absolutely responsible for getting him killed. Albeit briefly before Murakumo transformed into a Titan and then dying again as a Titan. While Tsubaki's hero worship of Murakumo is really cute, it's the intensity of Tsubaki's desire for revenge that reminds me of our old friend Eren Jaeger. Murakumo may be the one who transforms into a Titan to save the day, but Tsubaki is the one I suspect that Eren inherited the initial characterization from. Now, within the world of the pilot chapter, despite the fact that apparently there's never been a single successful mission to kill Titans around the border up to this point without the aid of a rogue Titan on humanity's side, the ordinary soldiers who don't have that ability to transform are not completely helpless. Every soldier is armed with a pair of, well, what I've been calling ignition blades that can easily cut a limb or two off of a Titan. The problem is that the Titans have the ability to regenerate, just like in the canonical Attack on Titan. But each Titan has a randomly placed weak spot. No weak spot is in the same place, and soldiers don't really have the luxury to carefully scan one Titan's body for their weak spot, when they're too busy being attacked by multiple Titans at once. If a single panel is to be believed, the soldiers may have access to something like grappling hooks to pin down the Titans, possibly as a reference to the iconography of Gulliver's Travels. But there's no indication that these grappling hooks are used for travel like the canonical omnidirectional gear. Instead, the soldiers just seem to be able to jump really high, anime leaping atop buildings and up the height of standing Titans. Now, the reason I'm bringing up the pilot chapter at all, other than I thought that it would be a fun detour, was to build the case that I felt that the premise of the canonical Attack on Titan was built around the main gimmick that the hero of the story would transform into a Titan to fight the other Titans. A sort of gross, giant, naked Ultraman. And through the lens of the pilot, I think that the visual appeal of becoming a giant CrossFit scary naked man is certainly a greater sell than being one of the boring, normal soldiers armed with a hot knife and supernatural jumping skills. So, if one were in charge of adapting this one-shot pilot into a bigger, serialized story, I would think to lean hard on the boy transforming into a monster to protect his home. Instead, the canonical Attack on Titan delays the original gimmick of the pilot transforming into a Titan to recapture the same fake-out of killing off its main character. But in doing so, it needed to improve upon the arsenal of the ordinary soldiers for the first couple of chapters, and sell a very different visual appeal to lay the groundwork for the greater surprise later, which gives us the omnidirectional gear, which might just be my favorite fictional tool used in any anime that I've seen. And look, the reason is really obvious. My favorite superhero is Spider-Man. I love the costume, I love the villains, I love his origin story, and I love watching Spider-Man swing across the city. I've had dreams about swinging between buildings. There's something about the momentum of swinging that's way more exciting to me than dreams about boring old flying. And one of the biggest selling points to watching Attack on Titan is the visual spectacle of watching soldiers zip across cities to slay giants, using the omnidirectional gear. The number one reason to be watching Attack on Titan as an original piece of fiction. Not just for the action set pieces they provide, but for the fantasy of being in that world. If you're a fan of Pokemon, you'd want to have a Pokemon, right? If you were in a mech anime, you'd want to be in the robot. If you were in Full Metal Alchemist, you would be an alchemist. And if you were a fan of Attack on Titan, you would want your own omnidirectional gear. Attack on Titan does such a good job selling the omnidirectional gear that the original premise of having the hero transform into a Titan suddenly feels like an afterthought. At the time, I thought Eren Jaeger transforming into a Titan was taking away the story of regular soldiers banding together and rising up to save humanity, only to then become a story of one angry guy that can Hulk out and become humanity's savior. And even though I knew Eren Jaeger was going to come back in advance, watching Mikasa in episode 7 get cornered both literally and mentally, and watching her grow the resolve to carry on and not give up in the face of death, that otherwise the love and memories she has for Eren, the man she loves, would die along with her, I thought was so incredibly moving. Only for her to be rescued by a scary CrossFit naked man, and in that moment, I felt that the return of Eren was taking potential character development away from Mikasa. I also didn't think that the Titan transformation was set up particularly well, but because of the pilot, I now know that this was always going to be the author's intent. So I'm less mad about the Titan transformation, but I do think that the visual appeal of the omnidirectional gear completely overshadows the ability to transform into a Titan. That, or maybe it's just because it's Eren Jaeger again. So at this point, it's possible that you might be thinking to yourself, we get it, okay? You don't like the main character of Attack on Titan. You know you don't have to, right? Can't you just ignore Eren and focus on someone else that maybe you do like? Sasha's pretty funny. You seem to like Mikasa well enough and hinted that you kinda like Levi, so why can't you just focus on those characters and ignore the actions of the main character? Why can't you just take the recommendation that Attack on Titan, the show, gets better later? Well, even if I could just ignore the story that revolves around the actions of the main character, the truth is that Eren Jaeger is only the second worst thing I hate about this show. The Titans. I hate the Titans. Not the transformed Titans like the Colossal, the Armored, or the Rogue Titan. They're somewhat iconic. I mean the regular, smiling, but emotionally static base Titans that wander around the world of Attack on Titan. Even if I could ignore the main character, I cannot ignore the Titans. If there were no Titans, there wouldn't be an Attack on Titan to talk about. Every time I see a Titan on screen, I get frustrated. So every episode with a Titan in it is a letdown. So why do Titans bother me? Well, while it's possible that I have an unexplored phobia of being crushed or eaten by giants, a somewhat niche fear that Attack on Titan uniquely provides, the functional reason is that Titans are basically zombies. And I also hate zombies. I have two problems with zombies. The first is the meta. The fantasy of committing a morality-free massacre that is justified within the context of the work of fiction. Outside of maybe the aesthetic, no one really fantasizes about being the zombie in the apocalypse, because they are somewhat intended to be disposable people, and heroes that might otherwise have a no-kill policy are given license to use the full extent of their powers on creatures that the author decides, well, those don't count as a person. So we finally get to see the hero use some lethal force, which I think is kind of gross. Why the heroes had no choice but to kill them is the in-universe defense of their actions built into the genre, but that's ignoring the culpability of the author for putting the hero in that situation. Zombies only exist within the imagination. We made them up. So if a non-lethal hero character isn't written within a world of zombies, why that character may have never used lethal force, unless the story and character development naturally leads them into it. Killing a zombie isn't really a choice. It's forced onto the characters, regardless of their own morality.
Dad, you killed the zombie Flanders.
You was a zombie?
The second problem I have with zombies are with the monsters themselves. A zombie is a victim of an infection that is usually played for easy drama, that isolates them from their loved ones until the transformation is complete, and they become a part of a mass of disposable people. By design, they can't count as people, or you risk alienating the audience from the lethal protagonist if that protagonist is intended to be sympathetic. But the problem with designing disposable people that don't count is that it's super easy to make an aesthetic or narrative choice that turns zombies into unintended commentary or caricatures, which demonizes real people. I truly believe that art is political. Even artists who would otherwise try and claim that their work is apolitical are revealing something in their denial. And nobody maliciously intends for their fictional race of monsters to become allegorical. But the problem with the zombie apocalyptic genre, even if you were to try to go for something as apolitical as possible, the political commentary is baked into it. We have to keep them out. They are monsters. They are unwanted. We might become just like them, and we have to kill them all. Again, it's not Attack on Titan's fault. It's built into the genre. But Attack on Titan is not otherwise an exception just because the disposable people in this context are much harder to dispose of. So the question that I have while watching Attack on Titan is this. What do they, the Titans, what do the Titans look like? Now, according to Hajime Isayama, the original inspiration for Titans came from the 90s shonen series Jigoku Sensei Nube, a series that follows a contemporary modern-day exorcist with a cursed Oni hand who works as an elementary school teacher. Each chapter primarily focuses on one of his students who has gained the unwanted attention of a dangerous yokai, presumably based on a real mythological one of Japanese lore, that the teacher then has to subsequently exorcise. But the specific chapter that allegedly inspired the Titans came from chapter 34 of Jigoku Sensei Nube, The Mystery of the Cannibalistic Mona Lisa. Within the chapter, a school painting is brought to life by the rumors that it can step out of its painting and eat people, and is suspected of being behind the murder of the school's rabbits. When the lead meddling kids catch the Mona Lisa stepping out of her painting, just like the rumor said, her normally subtle smirk becomes a massive open-mouthed grin as she lunges towards the kids. While it does turn out that the Mona Lisa was actually innocent of the crimes it was accused of earlier, the rising danger of the painting comes from the rumors that are making the painting more dangerous, as it's implied to finally have eaten the violent transient that was actually responsible for killing the school's rabbits to blow off steam. Now, that's just one origin of where the Titans had come from, but the common retelling of the author's inspiration for regular Titans came from a memory of an encounter he had with a drunk person at an internet cafe. Someone who looked very human but was unpredictable, belligerent, and couldn't really be communicated with. And then subsequent inspiration for Titans were designed based on photos of people in magazines, and then having those faces remain static as they wander about killing people. Since many of the subjects in the photos are smiling, the Titans are commonly depicted with a permanent grin on their face. While it's possible that I may have gotten some of these details mixed up or wrong concerning the original inspiration of Titans, I believe that it would be a disservice to try and point to the latter one to use it as a basis to vilify the author demonizing real people. Like I said before, no one typically tries to make their race of disposable monsters into caricatures of real people. The thing that bothers me about Titans is not any intended caricature by the author, but rather an unintentional caricature that I noticed, and one that I couldn't stop thinking about. For me, I focus a lot on the facial expression and the body language of the individual Titan, and my takeaway has been this: that there's something innately juvenile about them, and it's not just because they're always smiling. There's a certain lack of maliciousness in their behavior, like a child in a man's body. But applying that kind of body language to the mold of an adult, I recognize a type of character that would never be traditionally vilified in media. In short, I believe that the depiction of a regular Titan could be interpreted as disableist. and I have seen images of specific titans used alongside a specific slur. So I am confident that I'm not the only one who noticed this. But again, and I can't stress this enough, there's no way that's intentional. But this comparison ends up being compounded further through the adjacent parody series, Attack on Titan Junior High. In that universe, Titans have their own separate specialized school and are considerably less harmful to the surrounding human population and are more like a sometimes occasional nuisance. And yet, Eren Jaeger retains his canon counterpart's motivation to rid this world of Titans, for considerably sillier reasons. But by the end of the series, Eren is slowly beginning to triumphantly convince the people around him that yes, we can get rid of the Titans. We've got to get rid of the Titans. But within the context of this sillier universe, what exactly is Eren Jaeger proposing when he wants to get rid of the Titans? Does he want to kill them, or simply remove them from the neighborhood? Neither option makes him look good, and paints the same drive that Eren Jaeger has to rid the world of Titans in the canon story into heroic bigotry in the parody. And I can't unsee that. Every time I see a regular Titan walk on screen, I feel this sense of dread and get really frustrated because I feel like I'm watching a caricature or propaganda of something that I'm supposed to laugh at and want killed for the benefit of the quote-unquote normal people. If, like zombies, the Titans are victims of a condition or a transformation gone wrong, then why would I celebrate a serialized campaign to wipe them out? And for the record, I don't hate Attack on Titan because I watched the parody. I watched the parody because I hate Attack on Titan. There is a symbolic gesture within the first arc to compare the actions of the Titans as bullies. And if the Titans were bullies, then maybe it would be acceptable for the people terrorized as victims of their bullying to rise up together to beat them down. But a bully isn't a bully because they were born to be a bully. They're bullies because they choose to be bullies. They choose their targets and they choose to be cruel to them. And despite the joy plastered on their faces, I don't read choice coming from the Titans. There is one instance that I can think of where the actions of the normal Titans may be read as being intentionally cruel. In the 13th episode, it's revealed that the Titans do not need to eat people for sustenance, and when they've consumed a certain amount, a Titan will regurgitate the contents of their stomach and spit out a wad of decomposed people. And it's notable that it's Sasha, the hungry potato girl, that she is the one to stumble onto this waste, in multiple senses of the word. I think this scene is meant to be read as the Titans being cruel, but I think the intention of the scene is also to plant the idea that there's an unspoken reason that the Titans are eating people, and that it's a mystery meant to be explored further into the story. But in either case, I don't read this as the Titans being intentionally cruel, but rather I read this scene as being unnecessarily shocking. I, for one, had no interest in knowing the logistics of a Titan's digestive system. I would have guessed that their victims dissolved into their bodies to fuel their regeneration, or that Titans take a massive dump off screen. But I suspect that the imagery of a pooping Titan would have greatly reduced their intimidation factor, so instead they vomit their half-digested victims to rattle the survivors and presumably the audience. The Titans are the reason I don't want to watch any more episodes of Attack on Titan. Not unless the regular Titans were greatly reimagined in a way that gave them more characterization so that they can behave in an intentionally cruel way. I would also settle for Titans becoming more skeletal in design and significantly less like regular human beings. But even if you were to fix the Titans, that still wouldn't solve the previous problems I have with Eren Jaeger running the show. So my ideal version of Attack on Titan would have to be one that fundamentally changes the protagonist of the story and the major iconic thread of the series, while still being recognizably Attack on Titan. How you tell your story matters. Full Metal Alchemist has 3 different adaptations, the second of which, Brotherhood, is the most faithful to its source material. However, as an adaptation, it is not without its flaws. The first 13 episodes are paced and written in such a way that it presumes the audience has already watched the previous adaptation, which is why it glosses over earlier adventures and rushes through important character beats, producing a version of the story that feels incomplete on its own. But the first Full Metal Alchemist anime was a very different show to Brotherhood because the manga it was based on was still in relatively early publication and only had about 6 volumes and at least 1 light novel to draw material from. And yet, this version of the story was so incredibly successful that people wanted more Full Metal Alchemist and got an entire second anime within the same decade. The point I'm trying to make is that you can make a good story out of an existing property without being restrained by the minutiae of the source material. Which brings us back to Attack on Titan. As I mentioned earlier, I have seen the adjacent parody series, Attack on Titan Junior High, and aside from the ending, the series itself is very endearing and kind of surreal in a way that I think that people who love Attack on Titan and people who hate Attack on Titan can both find something in Junior High to enjoy. But I'm more interested in a version that's a little closer to the tone and intent of the original canon, without being the canon itself. So I watched the 2 live-action Japanese Attack on Titan movies. Now, if your interest in seeing a live-action version of Attack on Titan is based around wanting to see how the flight sequences with the omnidirectional gear would look like in live action, you might be disappointed. The special effects of the live-action films, particularly the omnidirectional gear, aren't great. The first film opting to shoot most of those sequences during night, in a heavy dark blue filter, that I found made it difficult to actually see what was going on. The characters may as well have just been flying. The effects of the transformed Titans are better, but they are very silly. Eren's Titan form in particular looks like an animatronic puppet in a rubber suit wearing a bad wig. But as a nominal tokusatsu fan that grew up watching Power Rangers, I love these sequences. And if you can get into the mindset of watching that genre and accept the look of Eren's Titan form, then I think the movie's version of an armored Titan, which somehow looks like the edgelord version of Eren's already edgelord Titan, I think is kind of cool. But if your interest in the live-action Attack on Titan movies is based on wanting to see the characterization of the cast in live action and seeing the compression of the first major arc into a self-contained story with an ending, I think the 2 movies are really interesting. In this version of events, the world is unambiguously post-apocalyptic Japan that was nearly wiped out by the sudden appearance of Titans, and the supposed last of humanity only seemed to exist behind 3 giant circular walls. Just like in the source material, knowledge about the outside world is forbidden, but in this version, this extends to interest in the outermost wall itself. No one is allowed to approach or climb up the wall, and members of the military are only stationed there to keep civilians out, but they themselves are not allowed to approach the wall. And because the scouts as we know them from the anime functionally do not exist prior to the start of the film, this creates a massive conspiracy for this version of Eren Jaeger, who has no love for the military in this version, and believes that the Titans themselves must not exist, that it's a fairy tale made up to keep people like him away from the wall, which incredibly changes the context for his apathy towards the society he feels trapped in. Because now, instead of the canon where Eren feels angry at people for not trying hard enough to open up the world for him, in the movie, Eren is angry because he feels like he's being actively lied to, that the world is hiding something from him. Granted, this does portray movie Eren as a sort of heroic conspiracy theorist, which, even if a fictional conspiracy is true in a given story, it's not a charismatic trait for the protagonist to have. But it does give him the basis for his arc, so we will come back to this. As a major plot detail we find out over the course of the two movies, it's only after the government had voted on the formation of a scouting party that the man who would secretly be the Colossal Titan takes action to force the people into moving further and further away from the outermost wall and subsequently further away from the truth of the outside world. Incidentally, the effects of the regular Titans in the movie appear to be mostly practical, with actors superimposed onto the screen to look like giants, with minor prosthetics to give them scars and one or two of them bug eyes. But because the actions and expressions of the actors shine through as their role as Titans, they look like they're having a lot of fun playing as Titans, which in turn ends up giving Titans a range of expressive emotions that the otherwise stoic normal Titans didn't seem to have in the canon. This does make them a little less scary overall, but I'll say that the sequence where they first make their entrance and proceed to completely destroy Eren's hometown is probably the scariest and best filmed sequence of both films. The scariest thing that happens isn't so much people getting killed by Titans, but the claustrophobia of being trapped in a flood of people, unable to break away as Titans just scoop you out of the crowd. There's a moment where a group of survivors try to lock themselves into what looks like a small church, but then the Titans just tear open the roof and proceed to pick them off until finally the group inside appear to be reduced into a bloody paste. It's really intense. With the destruction of his hometown and the subsequent loss of farmlands to feed the remaining populace, Eren Jaeger has many reasons to want revenge against the Titans, but just like in the original, his need for revenge is blindly narrowed down to wanting to avenge someone he loves. However, in this version, Eren's parents are already dead before the story even begins. So when it comes time for a loved one to be eaten by a Titan, it's not his mom that gets eaten. It's his childhood sweetheart, this movie's version of Mikasa Ackerman. I mean, supposedly. But this gives Eren his motivation for wanting to kill all Titans. And it gives the movie a reason to call him out on it later when Mikasa turns out to be alive, and is so dumbstruck by the revelation that he doesn't know what to do with his rage. Not only is Mikasa alive, but she hates Eren for seemingly leaving her to die and appears to be romantically involved with the much cooler Captain Shikishima. Eren Jaeger is kind of a loser in the movies. But Over the course of the two films, as Eren discovers more about the surveillance state that he lives in, he is given a choice to direct his anger towards the aristocracy that are responsible for the current destitution of the lower classes, or to complete his original mission to save the pocket of humanity and repair the hole caused by the colossal titan. In the canon, Eren's first instinct after discovering his Titan powers was to abandon the city of Tross to do his own thing, and only took up the mantle of hero when the alternative would have meant him or his friends being executed.
俺はここを離れる。もうすでに迷惑かけちまったが、俺はここから単独で動こうと思う。
In the movies, he's nearly killed for refusing to wage a war on the upper class if it meant more innocent people were going to be killed by titans.
君が死ぬほど嫌っていた身勝手な連中だぞ。100年以上も長いものに巻かれてきた家畜だ。悪しき体制を支えているだけで十分罪じゃないのか。
だからって殺していい人間なんていない。
Eren Jaeger in the movies is not given the same voice within the world that makes him uniquely special like his canon counterpart. He doesn't seem to have the same magical charisma he has in the first arc that made people want to fight on his side. But I was never convinced that Eren in the canon was worthy of this pedestal due to what I felt to be an extreme lack of empathy. While movie Eren does start his journey with very little empathy towards other people, the other characters that do actively suppress their feelings towards others, going so far as to belittle them as cattle, are generally vilified, which gives Eren a unique shadow to directly oppose for his heroic arc, where he has to develop empathy for the people. And that is the reason this is my favorite version of Eren Jaeger.
捨てない。もう誰も捨てない。
なんだって？
絶対。
どうやって？
どうやってもだ。
It should be noted that while it's easy to say that this version of Eren Jaeger is maybe better than his canon counterpart because it wasn't written by the author, Hajime Isayama was the one who insisted that the movie should be different from the source material because he didn't want the same story to be told again just in another medium. And so as someone who has an invested interest in watching different interpretations and adaptations of one story, I really do appreciate that gesture. But if there is a downside to this version of Eren Jaeger, then it would have to be the characterization of Mikasa Ackerman within the movie. The movie mostly portrays her stoicism as apathy, instilled into her by the trauma of having been eaten, those were her words, and the captain emotionally manipulating her, whereas the stoicism in the canon is based around her love and desire to watch over and protect Eren from harm. Both versions give Mikasa a traumatic event to justify her transformation into a hardened warrior, but only the movie portrays this shift in personality as a problem that needs to be fixed. So, like a cruel monkey's paw wish, the movie version of Attack on Titan changes everything I disliked about the source material, Eren's motivation and personality, his psychopathic backstory, and the depiction of the normal Titans into something more palatable, but in exchange, changes the characterization of the one character I really liked into someone that needs to be emotionally rescued to better facilitate Eren's new character arc. And honestly, I suspect that Mikasa is too important of a character within the story of Attack on Titan for that to have been a fair trade. Eren Jaeger is the main character of Attack on Titan, which is why I spent most of my time talking about my feelings towards him as the main character. But Eren Jaeger is part of a trio, and while I have talked a bit about Mikasa throughout, I haven't really talked about my boy Armin. Now, Armin's archetype, the intellectual, emotional soft boy, is my preferred mold of protagonist. And like Mikasa, I actually felt that the chance for interesting character development was lost when Eren Jaeger didn't stay dead. Regardless of Armin's military training alongside Eren and Mikasa, his weaker constitution and anxiety painted his character as one of the weaker soldiers in his group, while Eren had the luxury of being the protagonist, which gave him a layer of plot armor that a supporting character like Armin just wasn't guaranteed to survive without, especially within a genre that was very likely to kill off Armin for the sake of Eren's character development. During that brief window of time where Attack on Titan was teasing the idea that they had killed off its main character, I was thinking in the hypothetical that there was a missed opportunity for Armin to explore the idea of becoming more self-reliant, someone who could protect himself, since up to this point he was characterized as someone who needed Eren to always protect him, which, incidentally, got Eren killed. And I would have been interested in seeing how Armin's guilt would have manifested long-term between him and Mikasa, especially if there was tension between the two. If Mikasa had, for example, blamed Armin for Eren's death, rather than what actually happens is that Armin lamenting the cruelty of the world and then briefly contemplating suicide. Now, it's possible that some of this might still come into play after the first 13 episodes. But here's the thing. I'm not that interested in Armin to march through more episodes full of Titans and Eren Jaeger to find out. Just like the characterization of Mikasa in the live-action movies, it doesn't seem like a fair trade to me. Attack on Titan, as it begins, is kind of a rough sit. And that's the thing about a first impression. It might not be the whole experience, but it does carry the weight of the intended experience. Based on the first 13 episodes alone, Attack on Titan is the story about a young, angry man who had been wronged by the world around him, and in the pursuit of revenge, becomes the very monster he set out to destroy. I suspect that premise has not changed very much, and I am frankly not interested in that story. There are plenty of other anime I could watch, this is not the one for me. If you believe that the first 13 episodes is an arbitrary cutoff for an unfair generalization, I would say that there are plenty of other shows that are more than capable of selling themselves in fewer episodes. Assassination Classroom is about reaching kids that have been disenfranchised by an elitist, classist education system, while also showcasing itself as an action comedy by giving said kids guns to shoot their functionally invincible teacher. And that's all in the first episode. It doesn't take 4 episodes for them to get their prop weapons. They're shooting the teacher in the first few minutes. My Hero Academia is ultimately about a disadvantaged kid given an extraordinary opportunity to become something greater than he was predestined for, although I have argued that the story actually started out as a kid with a disability metaphor who was able to prove himself beyond the expectations of his society, but the disability angle was editorialized into only a passing nod in favor of greater visual spectacle, so that he can punch things really hard. Personally, I'm insulted, but it's still just 3 episodes to set all of that up. One Punch Man, true to his name, takes 1 chapter to set up the story of one dull-looking man with one dull-sounding origin story who is in fact ridiculously strong but is dissatisfied with that strength. Now, based on the previous examples I just made, how many episodes does it take for the premise of Attack on Titan to become clear? Is it the iconic arrival of the Colossal Titan and the death of Eren's mom at the end of episode 1? Maybe, but you'd have to impose foreknowledge of later story beats of Eren becoming a soldier and becoming a Titan. The former being pretty obvious because he said he wanted to, and to be fair, it's the initial draw of the show, see the opening title sequence. Though he doesn't become a full soldier until episode 4. But the latter, transforming into a Titan, is not obvious because the series was intentionally withholding that information. But you cannot use foreknowledge of later chapters to justify the content of earlier chapters. Future chapters have the benefit and burden of building on top of past chapters, but past chapters do not have the same luxury. You have to judge them as they are. The 6th episode makes the characterization of Eren Jaeger, I think, even worse than he was in the 1st episode. But when I'm talking about the 1st episode, I do not cite the content of the 6th episode because the problems I have with the 1st episode are unique to the 1st episode. And the pilot chapter with Murakumo doesn't count as foreshadowing the Titan transformation because that's knowledge outside of the canon that the common viewer is not expected to have known about. So the Titan transformation really does just kinda come out of nowhere. Maybe it's a problem with the medium, and the first major arc of Attack on Titan just works better as a movie rather than a 13 episodic television show released weekly. After all, the death of Eren's mother works really well as the point of attack in a hero's journey rather than as the climax to the first chapter. For what it's worth, there is an animated movie that condenses the events of the first 13 episodes into a 2-hour feature film called Crimson Bow and Arrow. The movie does remove the training camp episodes and opts to instead skip forward in time to the graduation ceremony after the fall of Eren's hometown, which thankfully means that the movie retains roughly the same tone throughout, something that I was initially annoyed with while watching the series proper. The movie also, thankfully, removes the bulk of the 6th episode that focused on Mikasa's backstory, though Mikasa still has flashes of her backstory during her lowest point in the equivalent episode 7, so we still see Eren stab a dude, but there's no context outside of that rescue that paints Eren like a predator. Now, even though I like the 9th episode for briefly following Captain Levi and his team rather than the dour circumstances of the main story, honestly there's no reason to have retained that sequence for the movie. As soon as Eren's Titan form successfully plugs the boulder into the hole of Wall Rose, and after getting a reaction shot from the surviving characters, the movie immediately cuts to black before Levi can show up, and then he just subsequently shows up in a post-credits scene like it's a Marvel movie. Considering Eren's inner monologue leading up to the climax, I actually have no problem with the movie cutting to black after that high note, but it's strange for Levi to be in the movie at all. If the movie insisted on having him be in the movie, I'd have tried to put him within the city of Trost and just have him operate on a different part of the map away from the rest of the cast. The Titans are still the Titans. Their screen time is greatly reduced for the movie's runtime, but it doesn't change the problems I have with them. I don't like watching the Titans, and watching more Titans is what I'm ostensibly being asked to do when I get repeated recommendations to watch the show. And that's the long and short of it, isn't it? There is no Attack on Titan without the Titans. I don't like the Titans, they're in the show, and so I don't like the show. Eren Jaeger, the omnidirectional gear, transforming titans, these are all theoretically good reasons to be watching the show, but as I've gone over, Eren Jaeger is a bad person, and not in a way that makes him interesting. The ability to transform into a titan is completely overshadowed by the superior omnidirectional gear, and even the omnidirectional gear, the coolest thing in the show, literally runs out of gas to showcase Eren's cool new Titan transformation, which, again, is not that cool. The stuff that I like about this show, the art, the music, the omnidirectional gear sequence, Mikasa, Armin, Levi, Sasha, and any scene where Eren Jaeger is humiliated in some way, is not enough. It's not enough to be told that there will be more of that stuff in the future, because there will always be more Eren Jaeger and more Titans to sit through. And no amount of revelations, expositions, or retcons in later episodes will change my feelings on the direct presentation of the first 13 episodes. But I'm not mad at Hajime Isayama, nor am I mad at the director of the anime for bringing Attack on Titan to life. I would like to believe that I can dislike the work without seemingly criticizing the author personally. However, if I am to be misconstrued as hating the person for his work, then I feel that I need to retract something so that the intent of my words will be made 100% clear. It's not Attack on Titan that I hate. I have always hated the recommendation.